Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, so honey from the devil's fingers tastes bitter. Let that sink in. Honey from the devil's fingers tastes bitter. And I'm starting with that because the word study for today is bitterness. And we're going to pick up with the different feasts of the Lord, or the appointed times of the Lord, I'll say. Right. So we started with Passover and why that happened. What was the reason they had to put the blood on the door? What did that point to? How did that relate to the Messiah? Why was it important to us who are living today? And talked about how that was just basically the beginning of a covenant that we would enter in, and we would be. A covenant is just a contract between two persons, and that covenant was sealed or with the blood of the Lamb through the death of the Messiah. He put his stamp or his seal that makes our eternal life sure, and our forgiveness and our being back at one with God. It makes it sure. So, got the night of Passover, and the firstborns are taken if they didn't have the blood on their door. So immediately Pharaoh says, "Y'all gotta go." They leave with a bunch of spoils, gold, all things that they would end up using later to build the temple. But not only did they leave with riches, basically, and treasures, they left with people who were the treasures as well, a mixed multitude. So it was not just the children of Israel who were delivered that night. It was a mixed multitude, people from who didn't initially believe in the God of Israel. So that's Passover night. 2 days later, which would be the third day, you have the Feast of First Fruits. But before that, okay, Passover, the day after Passover is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day feast. And I'll go back over the Feast of Unleavened Bread and First Fruits on another video. But I want to skip ahead because bitterness was on my heart to share and talk with. And excuse me, really, I've never sneezed this much in my life. All right, so you have Passover, then the very next day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day feast. In the middle of that 7 days, which on the third day is the first fruits, which would correlate with Jesus resurrecting on the third day. But so that will take us all the way up to the children of Israel actually leaving Egypt. And while they're on their way, they walked through the parting of the Red Sea in chapter 14 of Exodus. And 3 days after that, they arrive at our beginning text. They arrive, it says at Marah. All right, so Exodus 15:22 says, "So Moses brought Israel," and this is all going to connect to us why I titled this, the honey from the devil's fingers bitter. Right, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Let's talk about the whole nation of Israel. And they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, which means bitterness, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast it into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance. And there he, what? He proved them. He proved them. And said, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Right? So a lot of words just pop out and stand out. But basically, they've been delivered from Egypt. They saw how God delivered them with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, right? And after they had been crying out for hundreds of years, 400 years, they had been crying out. So when he brings them out, they, even though they had seen all those signs and wonders and miracles, they go 3 days into the wilderness and they completely forget about all that God had just delivered them from. And they begin what? Complaining. They were bitter. It says in verse 23, for they were bitter. And these waters represent the peoples, the nations, the tongues. And you can look that up. The Bible explains itself in Revelations that waters or seas are represent peoples, nations, kindreds, and tongues. So all of the people were complaining and they were murmuring against Moses. They had already been complaining up all through out the time that he was about to deliver them from Egypt, or be used by God to deliver them. They kept saying, we'd rather just leave us alone. Let us be slaves. We'd rather continue to serve than to die, basically, out in the wilderness. So in their hearts, what we're seeing is their hearts and their condition when they left Egypt. All right? They were bitter. They didn't truly believe that God was who he said he was. They didn't believe that he was the I am. That means everything. If he could deliver them and part the Red Sea, he could give them water. And even though the water, when they got there, was bitter, instead of them complaining, they should have acknowledged him and just asked him to give them water. So he says that they went through this test at Marah, which they're going to go through a couple more tests. But they went through this test in order for him to prove them. He's trying to pull the Egypt out of them. We've heard the cliche, you can take the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of the person. Same thing with Egypt. Spiritually, you can take the person out of Egypt, but you can't take the Egypt out of the person unless you are the Lord. And this was his way of doing that. All right, so we see that bitterness is connected with complaining, and not believing in God. And I talked in a few earlier videos about what belief is. Belief is actually hearing and obey. It's not just believing in the idea that he's there, but it's because you truly believe, you hear, you listen, and you obey. All right. So there's some other things that just want you to park in your mind. Verse 25, it says that he cried unto the Lord, that is Moses, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast it into the waters were made sweet. All right. So it says tree here that's being put into the water, and it turns the waters or the people sweet. All right, turns the waters sweet. Okay, so this brings the imagery back of the beginning. in the Garden of Eden. So let's go, I believe it's Genesis 3. We see another tree in the garden. And we know Genesis 3 is about the fall of mankind. They were being proved, they were being tested, and they failed. They did not obey. And it talked about, now the serpent was more subtle than any beast. I mean, verse 1, chapter 3 of Genesis. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And so, of course, the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. You don't have to listen to God. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And so the woman saw that the tree was good for food. She saw it with her eyes, and that it, well, which is the lust of the flesh, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, the lust of the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise. She took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. So that desire to make one wise, that's the pride of life. That's you worried about the cares of life. And they're basically being disobedient here. So we see that tree when they ate from the devil's fingers. It was supposed to be honey, so probably felt good in their mouths, but it became bitter in their bellies. Okay, so disobedience, not being content when you're complaining. You're not content. You don't feel like you have enough. There's always got to be more. Then that could bring about bitterness, and which comes along with the judgments. All right, because we know what happened after they ate. They were kicked out of the garden, which leads us to why we were on the Exodus in the first place. Everything from Genesis, once we were put out of the garden, all the way to Revelation, is a journey of how we get back into the garden where God wanted us to be with Him. Okay, so we have that tree there. And let's see. Okay. All right, so we have a tree there, but we also have, the tree of life. And that tree of life, it in the garden is in Exodus when they were commanded, God commanded Moses to put the tree in the water to make the water sweet. That tree was all pointing to the Messiah. He is that tree of life. All right, and he's what make the water sweet when we obey. When we do right, it's sweetness. If we don't do right, then it's curses. Okay, so I'm gonna try not to make this too long. Okay, so let's go to Deuteronomy 28, I believe. Because this whole journey, we're supposed to learn. We, just like the children of Israel were on a journey from Egypt to the promised land, we also are on a journey from Egypt to the heavenly promised land. And Paul talks about that in the New Testament, how we're on that same journey. So we're supposed to learn from their journey so we can enter in the promised land, because everybody who started on a journey did not make it into the actual promised land. And we're going to see why, starting with this first test or God proving them in Matter. And so after, and I'm going to skip forward, they're going to go through a couple more tests on their journey to Mount Sinai. Days later, they're going to receive the commandments. And we see that in Exodus 19 and 20. And they receive the commandments. And then we get to Deuteronomy. All right. So from that time, from them receiving the commandments all the way to this time in Deuteronomy 28, God has been proving them and testing them to see if they were going to keep his commandments or not. And towards the end of this book of Deuteronomy, we're going to see Moses is getting ready to die. They've been wandering in the wilderness because they didn't have to. It was because of their choices and their disobedience. But they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. One of the first generation ended up dying off because of their disobedience and unbelief. And then they're getting ready at this point to cross into the actual promised land. And Joshua, which is one of Moses' servants, is going to actually cross him over to the promised land because Moses is not going to be able to go. So this is where we are about to in Deuteronomy 28. And basically the covenant that was initiated from Passover all the way to Pentecost, or also known as Shavuot, when they got to Mount Sinai, that covenant, Moses is repeating. They're renewing that covenant there because their generation before them did not do what they were supposed to do. So he's renewing the covenant with this generation who is getting ready to cross into the promised land. So we have to think about that. We got the old and we got us now that are actually getting ready to cross into the heavenly promised land. And it's like we can hear these same words of Moses before we cross. All right. So Moses, let's see. He says like his final speech to them. I'll just pick up at 28 and 1 and we'll just kind of skip around so we don't make this too long. All right. So it says, one of my titles says blessings for obedience. All right. Don't forget that bitterness is disobedience, listening to the devil, basically. So you receive judgments. But when you obey, you have sweetness. When you obey the word. Okay, so it says, and it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. So this should remind us of what he said at Mara. He said, I'm doing this to prove you. If you listen to my voice, you're going to be fine. Right? And so he's reminding them, if you listen to the Lord, his commandments, then he's going to set the children of Israel, that nation, above all the nations of the earth. And it says, and all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. So it's conditions to the blessings. All right. When they enter the promised land, they still have to follow commandments. So he lists off the blessings. Blessed shalt thou be in the city and in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of the body, the fruit of the ground, the fruit of thy cattle. Basically, everything on the earth, even the earth, is going to be blessed by their obedience. And when you're coming, when you're going, all right, just like the Aaronic blessing. So he also talked about the enemies, how the Lord shall cause thine enemies that rise up against thee to be smitten before thy face. They shall come out against thee one way and flee before thee 7 ways. So they were just going to be blessed all the way around, on all sides. And God was doing that because he had set these people apart for himself to be a blessing, to be a light to the world. That's why he gave them the commandments. That's why he delivered them by coming down himself. Okay, so but he says in verse 15 of 28, but it shall come to pass if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God to observe to do to hear and obey, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Okay, so the curses, you're going to be cursed in the city, cursed in the field. Basically, everything that was supposed to be blessed will be cursed. And it says, verse 21, skip down there. The Lord shall make, let's go back to 20. The Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke, and all that thou settest thine hand unto for to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me. The wickedness, they're not following his commandments. In verse 21, the Lord shall make the pestilence cleave unto thee, until he have consumed thee from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. All right, so if you obey, it's sweet, you have blessings. If you disobey, it's bitter, you have cursings. All right. And so we can skip down. Let's go to verse 30. And he's just telling them why and how they're going to be blessed here. But the blessings are based on the conditions of obedience. All right, so next. So after he tells them that, these are the conditions, that's when the covenant is again renewed, right before they're getting ready to cross over into Israel. And this is Moses. He said, these are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, beside the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. That's Mount Sinai, all right, the commandments. And Moses called unto all Israel and said unto them, ye have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt unto Pharaoh and unto all his servants and to all his land. The great temptations which thine eyes have seen, the signs and those great miracles. Yet the Lord hath not given you a heart to perceive and eyes to see and ears to hear until this day. So basically they were blind. That's why they struggle so much. All right. And it says, and I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not waxing old upon you, and thy shoe is not waxing old upon thy foot. Ye have not eaten bread, neither have ye drunk wine or strong drink, that ye might know that I am the Lord your God. So everything they went through the wilderness, he was guiding them so that they could know that he is the Lord their God. So he could be their God, their king. They didn't need a Pharaoh. Okay. So everybody is there. You have the different nations, the tribes, the elders, the mixed multitude. And it even says, reminding them, keep therefore the words of this covenant in verse 9, and do them, that ye may prosper in all that you do. Ye stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, your captains of your tribes, your elders, and your officers, with all the men of Israel, your little ones, your wives, and thy stranger that is in thy camp, from the hewer of thy wood unto the drawer of thy water, that thou shouldest enter into covenant with the Lord thy God, and into his oath, which the Lord thy God maketh with thee this day, that he may establish thee today for a people unto himself, and that he may be unto thee a God, as he has said unto thee, and as he has sworn unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Neither with you only do I make this covenant and this oath. Listen up. But with him that standeth here with us this day before the Lord our God, and also him that is not here with us this day. Our ancestors were there, and he was telling them so that we could read these words today and be prepared before we cross into the promised land. Verse 16 says, for ye know how we have dwelt in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the nations which ye passed by. And you've seen their abominations and their idols in wood, their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which are among them. And if you know anything about Daniel, there's a vision given to Nebuchadnezzar, and all of these metals are represented, and they represent the kingdoms of this world. All right. So I don't have time to go into all that, but that is should point our mind to that. Okay, so he basically warned us. If we go into the promised land and we obey him, it'll be sweet for us. Not just in our mouth, but in our bellies. But if we don't, it'll be bitter for us. We'll have curses for disobedience. But what does the devil want us to do? He wants to disobey, so we receive the curses. 30. And he already knew that once we went into the promised land, we would not obey. Moses knew that. He said, I've been with y'all 40 years and y'all still not listening and obeying. So I already know once you get in the promised land, you're going to disobey. But he didn't leave us there. He knew that we would also come back. And it says in chapter 30, verse 1, and it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations, whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee, and shalt return unto the Lord thy God, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Okay, so he says when you're there, when you realize this, that the curses have fallen upon you because you turned away from me, you turned to idols of wood, stone, silver, gold, return to the Lord thy God and obey. So we got to turn to him and listen to what he's commanded us. All right. And he says, then when we do turn, in verse 3, that then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity, your bondage, and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all nations whither the Lord thy God has scattered thee. So that's what we want him to do, but we have to turn first. We have to turn to him. Then his compassion will be upon us, and he will return and gather us all in so that we can be with him forever and no longer be scattered. We're so scattered we don't even know who our identity is. We don't know that we're a part of Israel because of our disobedience and our turning our backs on God. We were scattered, and he told us that that would happen. But at the end of time, he said he's going to gather us back in, but we have to turn to him. Okay. And then he says it'll be completed. Verse 5, and the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed. That was the promised land. And thou shalt possess it, and he will do thee good and multiply thee above thy fathers. And the Lord thy God will circumcise thine heart and the heart of thy seed, to love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. So that's what he wants. He wants us to be in the promised land, that heavenly promised land. All right? Because this earth and this heaven will pass away, but there's going to be a new heaven and new earth, and that's where he wants. That's the promised land. Not only that he was talking to, he talked to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yes, they made it there, but he was also pointing toward the heavenly promised land, where we're going to be planted and we'll never be removed again. Everything will be, our hearts will be circumcised. There will be no more bitterness, no more complaining, no more disobedience. And then it'll be all good. All right. So almost done here. So that's the covenant. And he set before them that day. Fortunately, this speech that he was giving was a witness for the people who were staying there today all the way until the end of time. Verse 19, it says, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you. That means it's a witness, it's a testimony that I have set before you, life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. So it's just not about us, it's about the seed as well, those who coming up after us. Verse 20, that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and that thou mayest obey his voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto him. Are we hearing a pattern, a repetition here? We've gone through about 3 or 4 chapters, and he keeps pointing us to love him with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. Okay, and it says, for he is thy life. It's not the waters of this world. He is our life, and the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. He is the one that preserves us. It's not these kingdoms and these institutions that we see in the world. He is our life, and he is our length of days if we want to live on forever. Okay? So that's 31. Joshua's getting ready to succeed Moses, telling them they're going to the land. Don't worry about the enemy there. Just be of good courage and be strong. And those words, when you look at the breakdown of them, they're talking about walking in obedience, doing what God said to do. That's how you're strong and of good courage. And he rereads the law again. Then Joshua is commissioned to actually lead them over into Israel. Okay. But he tells them again, chapter 31, 27, for I know thy rebellion and thy stiff neck. Behold, while I am yet alive with you this day, ye have been rebellious against the Lord. And how much more after my death, right? So he already knew that they were going to go in to the promised land and mess up. And they were going to turn aside from the ways that he had commanded them. But he warns us, verse 29, for I know that after my death ye will utterly corrupt yourselves or defile yourselves and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days, because ye will do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. Remember, we talked about that mark and that sign is bound on your hands. So the work, the evidence of their work of their hands is not what God has commanded. So Moses spake all in the ears of all the congregation that were there. The Song of Moses. We're not going to go into that. Okay. And Moses' death, he gives final blessings. This is what I wanted to get to before we get ready to get off. But after all that, even though he knew there would be stiff-necked and rebellious, like God knows us, there were still blessings that he spoke over all the 12 sons of the 12 tribes of Israel. And those blessings all will be fulfilled when he brings us back into the land. There were blessings, there were eternal blessings. So all is not lost. Even though we have been scattered, all is not lost. We will be gathered back together if we return to him. Okay, so that's on the bitterness. We look at just a couple more scriptures. Lamentations 3:15, it says, he hath filled me with bitterness. He hath made me drunken with wormwood. So because when they got into the promised land, they didn't do what they were supposed to do, God kept his word. They chose death and cursings. That's what they got. That was the wormwood, the bitterness. And it said, and it relates that bitterness with drunkenness. That's important, especially when you're reading Revelations. Lamentations 3:19, remembering mine affliction and misery, the wormwood and the gall. So all of the judgments and the affliction and the misery that came with disobedience are compared with wormwood and gall. In wormwood, we're going to see in Revelation, means bitterness. Okay. Lamentations, the next verse, verse 20, my soul hath them still in remembrance and is humbled in me. This I recall to my mind, therefore I hope. It is the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. So him allowing us to experience that bitterness it's also him being compassionate, because it's supposed to turn us to him. It's supposed to make us consider, like, oh, no, something not right. I didn't eat something good. Something's not agreeing within me. So I need to turn to him. So let's connect this with Revelation 8, verse 11. In the third seal, and I don't have time to go into all the seals and the trumpets, but in the churches, but they basically overlap one another, and they're unfolding throughout the church history, starting from the first century church when Christ was dead, died, buried, and resurrected, and then the whole church was born on the day of Pentecost. So don't have to go time to go into all that, but during the third trumpet, that's what we're reading in Revelation 8. There is this wormwood mentioned, and that's important. And just the time frame throughout church history is going to be during the time frame through the third church history, like around 300 to 400 BC, around that time. And this is when the church, or the Christian church, basically began compromising and mixing truth with error. And holy with unholy. Okay, so it says verse 11, and the name of the star is called wormwood. Okay, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Okay, so this, at the third trumpet, a star named wormwood, it falls on the what? The waters, on the people, nations, kindreds, and tongues. And many men died of the waters. This is symbolic, because they were made bitter. Right? Why were they made bitter? Again, during this time, you see compromise. You see the same thing that Moses had been warning them about. You see them turning aside from God's commandments and mixing and mingling, um, and drinking the honey from the devil's fingers. Okay, and they realize it's bitter. It only comes with cursings. All right. So, and we'll skip down to Revelation 10. So after we go through all of the rest of the trumpets, in Revelation 10, John, the Revelator, is he sees another aspect of this vision. He's given more details, and it says, Revelation 10 and 9, and I went unto the angel and said unto him, give me the little book. And he said unto me, take it and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of the angel's hands and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. And he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many waters, before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. Okay, so John is told to take this book and eat it. Right? It's basically the book of remembrance, all the things that have been done. It's a book of judgments. And he takes it, and it's sweet in his mouth, but there's something not right, because in his belly it's bitter. So, and he's basically showing, it should point our minds back to how the waters were made bitter in Mara, and why. In that tree that made the waters bitter in the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right, and I believe it's in Psalms, the scripture says, the fear of the Lord is clean and enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. So when we're obeying his judgments, his laws, it's sweet. It's sweeter than honey. But when we don't, it's bitter. All right. It comes with bitterness and cursings. So many other um, scriptures in the Bible that connect bitterness with disobedience, and but we have a cure. We have a cure, and he was one that was lifted up high on the wood, just like in Exodus, another text that they received. They were complaining so much and grumbling so much that God allowed serpents to bite them. And the only way they were healed is if they looked at this pole that God commanded Moses to make with a serpent wrapped around it. And this pole was lifted up, and they had to obey. They had to listen and look at um, that look at that pole. That was the only way they were healed. So the only way we're healed is when we obey. Only way we're blessed, only way it's sweet is when we obey and we look up at the one who's lifted up high on the wood, which is no one other than Yeshua. All right, so I went way longer than what I wanted to, but again, I hope that you are blessed. And I'll be talking more about this journey from Egypt to Sinai, and then Sinai to the Promised Land.